In the closing remarks of the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul says something that, if he were to say it today, would cause many people to become outraged. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 13 and 14, this is what the Apostle Paul has to say. Be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. All that you do must be done in love. Now, as I said, this would cause outrage today in much of the general public. To say act like men is a phrase now that would be interpreted as patriarchal, as misogynist. Someone says act like men, and another person would say, well, you simply hate women. Or they would challenge you by saying masculinity is toxic, and when you tell someone to act like a man, you are trying to get that person to do something that does not align with their character. Perhaps they want to be more feminine, or even in our society today, well, perhaps that man is not a man. Perhaps that man is now a woman, and you cannot force that person to have the gender that you would assign them. They get to assign their own gender. They get to choose their own identity. I think it's safe to say, and I think Christian men who are brave enough to stand up would admit the fact that masculinity, that manhood, is under attack in our day and age today. As a result of this, even the character of Jesus in just popular society has become very weak and fragile and feeble. We see even Jesus looking like a hippie in a lot of depictions. People believe that Jesus was all about peace and love, and that if Jesus were here today, that he would side with the social justice warriors. This, of course, is not the truth. It can't be any further from the truth. Jesus was a very masculine man. So in this video, let's take just a few moments to consider that Jesus was a masculine man. In his book, The Manliness of Christ, Dale Partridge speaks about Christ versus our culture. This is what he writes. As a culture, we have largely produced a caricature of Christ based on the anemic and soft-smiled Roman Catholic paintings where Jesus looks like he's just put on a fresh coat of blush and tweezed his eyebrows. Add the rise of feminism, the deconstructionist movement, and the progressive church, and you end up with a delicate Jesus who's knocking gently on the door of your heart. But it goes much further than this. Our modern culture despises masculinity. In fact, any form of masculinity that doesn't adhere to the world's standard is deemed toxic. There's a reason Ariana Grande's song, God is a Woman, was #1 on Billboard's Top 100 list. Now, clearly, Christ was masculine, and I think we see this from the scriptures. But he was masculine in at least 3 ways. There are 3 characteristics of Jesus that we can point to that show his biblical manliness and masculinity. The first one we need to discover is Jesus' boldness. In Luke chapter 14, 26 through 27, and also verse 33, the Bible here says, as Jesus gives this saying to his disciples, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. This would have been very difficult for Jesus to say. Imagine saying this today. It would bring mass confusion. Wait, you're telling me that I have to love you more than my family members, more than my spouse, more than all of my good friends? You see, Jesus was not afraid to say what he knew that he needed to say. He was bold, and when he spoke the truth, he did so with clarity and with conviction, because he knew who it was who sent him to the earth to perform his mission. In this way, and in many other ways in the scriptures, Jesus was very bold. He was not afraid to tell the truth. We must adopt that as men today in our culture. We need to stop being afraid of telling the truth. So many times in our world today, the truth is hidden in a corner because people are afraid of offending anyone. Well, Jesus wasn't so afraid of offending people. He knew that his message would offend people. In fact, Jesus did not come to bring peace, he said, but a sword. And this sword would divide. It would divide families. It would divide husbands from wives and friends from their other friends. Jesus knew that the truth was a dividing line in a sense, but he wasn't afraid to speak it. Even when he knew other people would be upset by it, he still said it anyway because he understood the importance of standing boldly on the truth. This indeed is a masculine trait and something that the Bible prescribes for all men, all biblical men to do. So Jesus was very bold in telling the truth. But secondly, Jesus also had fearless intensity. Consider this other quote here from Dale Partridge. Did he quietly respond with, "Excuse me, what you're doing is correct"? This is in regards to his speaking to the Pharisees. Or are you aware that you are sinning? No, instead, he invokes intense, aggressive, and cutting language to publicly shame, convict, and even condemn those who stand against God. He calls them to their face hypocrites and liars, Matthew 23:13, John 8:55. He calls them a brood of vipers. He calls them children of Satan, John 8:44, sons of hell, Matthew 23:15, a wicked and adulterous generation, Matthew 16 and verse 4, whitewashed tombs, Matthew 23, verses 27 and 28, fools, Luke 24:25, and blind guides. Ultimately, there is another side of the compassionate Jesus, he writes, an intense, angry, mocking, and even satirical side of our Savior. Consider this fearless intensity to look at the Pharisees and to call them those things and to assume not just that they were doing something wrong, but to authoritatively speak on the fact that if they did not change, that they would indeed be sentenced to hell. As Jesus says in Matthew 23, "You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell?" It takes a very strong masculine man to say those things. It does not take a weak person at all. It takes fearlessness, and indeed it takes intensity. How many times do you hear Christians today say that we should approach people as Christ approached people, that we should almost allow people to walk all over us, and that we should never tell them the truth? And if we do tell them the truth, it must be a very soft and watered down truth because we would not want to hurt them or offend them in any way. This is not the model of Christ. This is not the authority that he's shown. And of course, it is not an example of his fearless intensity. But also I want to read from the scriptures again for you in Mark chapter 11, starting in verse 15. And here the scriptures say, "Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple area and began to drive out those who were selling and buying on the temple grounds. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple grounds. And he began to teach and say to them, 'Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers.' And the chief priests and the scribes heard this, and they began seeking how to put him to death." Now listen to this. "For they were afraid of him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching." Jesus was the type of man where he knew when the right moment was to, essentially, I like to say, cause a scene. If you were to go do this in an establishment today, start flipping tables and driving people out with a whip and everything else, people would claim that you were outraged, that you were a madman, a psychopath, or that you were a hothead, way too angry, that you took it way too far. Well, in this instance, Jesus understood that as his first authoritative public act as the Son of God and as the Messiah, this needed to be done. Consider the fearlessness and also the intensity that Jesus had shown here. He was not a weak man. He was bold. He had fearless intensity, and he was not afraid to say what needed to be said and also to do what needed to be done. And this brings us to our third point. Jesus was also a displayer of sacrificial love. He was very masculine because of his sacrificial love. We know that Jesus died for the sins of all mankind. Jesus died for you and for me. This is no small thing, obviously. Jesus gave his life. He gave his life. He laid his life down, not for anything that he had done, but for the sins of me and for the sins of you. That takes a strong presence of sacrificial love. The Bible commands men to do the exact same thing. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul writes, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her." Jesus Christ loved people. And because of this love, it drove him to a great sacrifice. As men, we are commanded through the scriptures to also show that same display of bravery, of courage, and of sacrificial love for our wives, for our children, for our families, and for those that we love. The Bible never commands women to lay down their lives for their husbands. This really seems to be a masculine trait, to do what needs to be done and to be willing, even if it means to sacrifice your own life, that you are able to do it. Well, those were just three examples of Jesus being a masculine figure in the scriptures. As always, we would invite you to listen to the podcast, The Religious Coffee Hour, on any podcasting platform that you wish. We also are trying to do our thing here on YouTube as much as possible, and I'm going to be coming out with some short form content, some more bite-sized videos like this one, and also longer interviews and podcast videos as I get the time. Please consider like and subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you stay up to date every time we post. Thank you so much for joining us today. As always, walk by the Spirit, live by the Spirit, and keep on drinking that good spiritual coffee.